Who has the greatest domain expansion in Jujutsu Kaisen? In this video, we're going to take a look at the pinnacle of Jujutsu and see who is its most proficient user. This is a pretty hot topic within the JJK community, especially when it comes to Gojo and Sukuna's domains. And if you go really deep, some people even think Kenjaku is the strongest domain user. But let's talk about this because we are rapidly approaching the domain clash of the Gojo versus Sukuna fight. So let's dig into the most powerful barriers we've seen so far. In Kenjaku's domain, Gojo's domain, and of course Malevolent Shrine. But before we get into discussing that, let's talk about the greatest honorable mention, Chimera Shadow Garden. Despite being incomplete, it has some of the most incredible potential of any domain we've ever seen in the series or heard about. And if it's able to clone Mahoraga, because if you can clone Mahoraga within Chimera Shadow Garden, well, that's pretty busted. Though we'll just have to wait to find out, because we haven't seen Chimera Shadow Garden since the Reggie fight. That all being said, let's talk about Malevolent Shrine. Surprisingly, of all of Sukuna's abilities, we actually know quite a bit about Malevolent Shrine. Sukuna cracked this thing open in Shibuya, we get the full description of it, we see it has a 200-meter radius at the cost of an escape route via Binding Vow, and so far it is the only domain known to have a Binding Vow attached to it, and narration refers to this as a divine technique. Sukuna is able to set his Dismantle and Cleave to target inanimate or animate objects, and as far as we know, the Malevolent Shrine Blender only has one setting, and that's max. So Sukuna, as a shock to nobody, has an incredibly powerful domain and what looks to be one of the most refined in the entire series. But at the end of the day, a domain expansion is just a barrier technique to create a barrier-confined space to pace your territory. And even for characters like Kenjaku and Sukuna who have an open barrier domain, it is still a barrier technique and they still have a sure hit effective range. It just has an open outer shell for the actual barrier. And this made it very difficult for Tengen to find out how to dismantle Kenjaku's domain. Because normally when dismantling a domain like Tengen was trying to, you just go straight for the barrier. But if the domain has an open barrier, it is significantly more difficult to dismantle it. And the only way Tengen was able to do this was by dismantling the outer shell of the sure hit effect, and the only way they knew where the sure hit effect range was because Kenjaku opened his domain inside of their barrier. Had Kenjaku done this in a separate area, Tengen likely would have had to guess where the edge of the sure hit was. And Kenjaku's domain is directly compared to Sukuna's as the same feat. But unlike Kenjaku's domain, he has a Binding Vow attached to his, and he is able to change the radius on a whim. And if he can do that, he should be able to adjust the sure hit radius as well. So when Sukuna opens his domain, good luck figuring out where he decided to put his sure hit effect radius. And that's if you're somebody who is even capable of dismantling a domain like this. And a lot of people think that Kenjaku is a superior barrier user to Sukuna. Well, not only are they directly compared as having the same feat, Tengen also mentions that Kenjaku is one of the few barrier users that is on their level. And Sukuna is pretty much guaranteed to be on this level as well. Even Tengen calls his domain feat incredible. And another barrier user that is likely on Tengen's level would be Gojo. And we've only really ever seen Gojo use his domain twice, and one of those times was a 0.2 second domain. And Unlimited Void, as far as we know, it's overpowered, but it's also pretty simple. It just overloads your brain by blasting your mind with infinite information. So once you're caught in Gojo's domain, the fight is pretty much just over. You get hollow purpled, you're stunned, he can do whatever he wants to you. But who has the more refined domain of all these characters? Well, a lot of people think Sukuna's is the most refined due to narration calling it a divine technique. But Kenjaku's domain is directly compared to Sukuna's, and he never once wanted to domain clash with Gojo. And because of this, I would assume that Sukuna's is probably more refined than Kenjaku's, because Sukuna is 100% willing to open a domain against Gojo. The thing about Kenjaku is he's probably always going to have the best barrier feats just because he's Kenjaku. It's his whole plot. Kenjaku spends pretty much the entire end portion of this story dealing with barriers and trying to pop off a merger. And it's not to say that characters like Sukuna and Gojo can't interact with these barriers or make one similar to them, they just have no reason to. But even if Kenjaku's domain is weaker than Gojo and Sukuna's, I wouldn't be surprised if he has more general knowledge about barriers and just how to optimize curse energy with them, because Kenjaku's whole plan is predicated on having knowledge about barriers and domains to manipulate the culling games and other people. people. So for Kenjaku's sake, I hope he's the best at it. But who has the actual most powerful domain effect in this story? Well, I'm gonna throw in Mahito here because idle transfiguration is busted and most characters don't even have a way to properly defend against it. Nanami was able to instinctively defend himself with cursed energy around his soul, but a cursed technique used within a domain is superior to one used outside of it. At least this was the case with Kenjaku's gravity technique because it was definitely not doing this on its own. So Mahito's idle transfiguration within a sure hit effect, that's pretty terrifying. But as far as Malevolent Shrine and Unlimited Void are concerned, if I was directly comparing their on-paper feats right now and their effects, I would say Unlimited Void is probably better. Malevolent Shrine obviously has the added benefit of being able to mince an entire city. You could clear out a whole army with this thing and has a 200-meter radius, but Unlimited Void, once you're caught in this thing, the entire game is over, and in a 1v1, getting snagged for 0.2 seconds, that's all it takes. And as for Kenjaku's domain effect, the gravity technique, well, that's not even the actual domain ability. When Kenjaku opens his domain, it says Womb Perfusion, and I'll be honest, that doesn't sound like gravity to me. And we're probably going to see it coming up very shortly because I doubt we're going to go the entire series without him using his actual domain power. And while we're on the topic, I want to note that Kenjaku's domain crush was far more powerful than what we saw him use against Yuki. Yuki really only survived this because Tengen dismantled it in the middle of the sure hit. Yuki was about to become a human pancake. So who has the most powerful and refined domain of Gojo, Sukuna, and Kenjaku? So if we go purely off narration and have Sukuna ask about other people's domains, including Unlimited Void, which he should know about, his domain is definitely hinted at being the most refined. And while Kenjaku's domain is also exceptionally refined, the fact he never wants to clash with Gojo says a lot about how strong it is in comparison. So if I had to rank them on paper as to what they are right now, I would say Sukuna, Gojo, Kenjaku from best to worst. But where do I think they are going to be placed at the end of the series? I imagine that Sukuna and Gojo are going to be pretty equal in domain clashes. Maybe one will edge the other one out a little bit, but it's probably going to be a pretty close fight. I don't expect Sukuna or Gojo to just peel the other one's barrier away like Yuki had happen to her. And the reality is, we just don't have enough information on Gojo and Sukuna's domain to give a definitive answer as to which one is actually stronger than the other one. Until Gege actually feels like explaining to us how these interactions will work between an open barrier and a closed barrier domain if they aren't both using open barriers, all we can really do is make an educated guess, though I assume the domain clash between Gojo and Sukuna will give us a lot more explanation. Because Gege Akutame really likes dumping all the information about domains in one domain clash. Every single time we get a domain clash in this series, we get a little bit more information about them. And there is likely a lot more to Gojo and Sukuna's domain than what we've currently seen, because domains, they usually incorporate your technique in some way. And we've only ever seen Sukuna use this mantle and cleave inside of his domain, and we've only ever seen Gojo use an innate domain effect. And even though I like Gojo's Unlimited Void, as far as the interaction is concerned and the actual fight, I think it's a little boring because you don't really have much counterplay to Unlimited Void. You either get hit by the domain or you don't. So seeing them actually fight within their own territories, that would be pretty cool. But that's just my opinion, and now I want to hear yours. Let me know in the comments below. Who do you think is the best barrier user in Jujutsu Kaisen, and who do you think will have the most powerful domain? And if you like content like this, subscribe for more. And as always, thanks for watching.